I've been thinking a lot lately about rock, paper, scissors. Why do people play it? The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is to settle some trivial debate. But what makes rock, paper, scissors a better competition for this purpose than other games? Answering that question will be simple, but doing so will reveal a wealth of unique and powerful concepts in game design, and it's that stuff that I want to explore in this video. Then at the end, I want to share a game I've designed to showcase how those principles positively and negatively impact the player experience. Feel free to check it out on my website, and then leave a comment below if you do, letting me know what you think. So why do we play rock, paper, scissors? There are a few distinctive properties that are certainly useful. First, it's simple. Both players only have to make one guess between only 3 options, so no one needs to learn much to know how to play. Both players also have equal and non-zero chance of victory with that guess, so both players always have a shot at victory. And conversely, there's never a perfect answer. Anything you choose could be countered by the opponent, and you always have a chance to lose. And it's set up in such a way that both players have the same choice to make. They have the same tools and options available to them, and those options follow the same rules. Finally, the result is only determined by those 2 guesses. No outside factors influence the outcome. Now, the first 3 features are nice. In particular, obvious fairness is useful so that players are willing to play the game. But this last feature of rock, paper, scissors is what makes it uniquely suited for these types of competitions. You see, in most of the games we experience in real life, be they digital, analog, athletic, social, or otherwise, games typically rely on other stuff, some external thing that the players interact with, storytell around, or measure themselves against. And players usually have to compose a mixture of skills in order to achieve their goals in those contexts. But rock, paper, scissors only tests one thing: your guess. In a way, one game of rock, paper, scissors is not very meaningful, since it's quite random. But you also can't really blame anything for the result but your decision and your opponent's. There's no skill, talent, or technique you can execute that might also influence the result. The source of the randomness comes only from you and your opponent's minds. And that phenomenon is both very unique and quite powerful. Over a large number of repeated games, it means that rock, paper, scissors is a uniquely pure test for each player's ability to observe an arbitrary opponent. And I'm using the word pure here very specifically. I'm focusing on what types of experiences the players undergo. Pure games focus on a very limited number of mechanics, and the best ones allow players to explore those mechanics as deeply as possible. With each game of rock, paper, scissors, each player gains a little information about their opponent. And that information is the only information the player can use to give them an edge in the game. There's no comparison of skills or imbalanced positions, just which option each player selects. Rock, paper, scissors is unique in the degree to which the player's experience only operates by modeling their adversary's behavior over time. Rock, paper, scissors is the crystallization of this specific but rather universal player experience. It's the isolation of a minigame that occurs across games, genres, and life itself. The game of guessing how something will behave. This experience is general enough that it exists throughout multiplayer game design. And that's a lot of what this video series is going to be about. In this video and in subsequent ones, I want to show how guessing minigames work across genres and show the ways that they influence player behavior. I'm sure you've heard someone compare some moment or minigame in your favorite game to rock, paper, scissors, and if not, there are plenty of examples to choose from. Will the hockey player shoot the puck or pass? Will the tennis player return the ball down the line, cross court, or with a short drop shot? Is the poker player bluffing or not? Know thy enemy is a central tenet for battling any opponent in any medium. It's true that in these games, players express other skills to enact those decisions in practice, and in fact, those skills and their execution of those skills might be vastly more important than the quality of the player's guesses as far as the outcome of the game is concerned. The guessing games in these games themselves may not look much like rock, paper, scissors at all. Players may not be on even footing, and the results might be influenced by all sorts of external components. But the players are still guessing, and that guessing impacts how easy it is for those other skills to succeed. So their guess has an impact. It has some payoff. Ultimately, the guessing aspect of each of these games is just one of the many building blocks that comprise the total player experience. So, why would a game want to incorporate this type of guessing experience? To some degree, it's an unavoidable player behavior. It arises naturally from the desire to choose the correct answer when multiple options are reasonable choices. And a game generally does want to allow players to have multiple reasonable choices, or else creative expression becomes quite limited. On top of that, it's important for multiplayer games to at least be somewhat balanced. Even if there's a skill difference between players, or if one player's character is stronger than another, there should still be a game to play. Both players should generally have a chance to win, at least at the outset. These themes are an integral part of how a compelling multiplayer experience works. If you play traditional fighting games, for example, you've almost certainly heard people say stuff like
you're making predictions about each other constantly. Everything's a little micro guess, right?
Right? Rock, paper, scissors is a fundamental motif in this family of games, and players are accustomed to the idea that even the smallest decisions they make are, in a sense, tiny guesses. Personally, at this point, I don't think of rock, paper, scissors as a game at all, but rather as a minimal abstract representation of this experience of guessing against an opponent. And that representation, however simple it is, has a lot to explore. How does the player experience change, for example, when there are more choices to guess between? How does it change when players and options have asymmetric payoffs and asymmetric positions? The implications of details like this also enhance and diminish the player experience whenever rock, paper, scissors-like elements are present in a game. Those choices have vast implications that can enhance or diminish how fun the guessing aspects of a particular game are. But before I can talk about how the influence of rock, paper, scissors impacts the gameplay of other games, I should really go into depth about what rock, paper, scissors feels like to play, and what strategies players employ to outwit their opponents. Rock, paper, scissors is all about understanding the opponent. You can't make the winning choice unless they make the losing choice. Nothing else decides who wins, only those two choices. So how would a naive player approach this game? It's hard to argue for any specific strategy. All three options behave effectively identically. Let's say I'm playing against a computer, and I know for certain that it'll pick randomly between rock, paper, and scissors. At that point, to me, all three options are completely indistinguishable. I may be picking something, but in all three cases, the universe tells me after the fact whether I won or lost, based on something outside my decision-making. At this point, a first-timer typically just says, okay, whatever, I'll just pick the one I like, right? And that's certainly fine for one game, but what about the next time they play? If the player continues selecting the same thing, it won't take long for the other player to punish them. If a player always chooses rock, the opponent will eventually start only using paper. And even if a player always chooses rock or paper, and only neglects scissors out of the three options, the opponent can still win by only using paper. It has some chance of winning if the opponent plays rock, and doesn't lose if the opponent plays paper. The point is that no subset of the three options works, because the opponent can always safely respond to two options with a single selection. So players are eventually forced to change selections between the three options. And at this point, players will probably have some information about each other, right? When did the opponent change their choice? What were they reacting to? Will the opponent adjust their strategy again? A critical question becomes apparent every time the game repeats. How much should each player react to the information they've gained about the opponent's strategy? Certainly at least a little bit, right? At a minimum, if the player selects the same thing every time, you should punish it. And players can be stubborn. If you don't show me I need to change my choice, I might not. So if two players have just played their first round against each other, it makes some sense that they might try to counter each other's last choice. As they do so, a few interesting symmetries come into play. First, let's say two players play a game with rock winning against scissors. The player choosing rock, wanting to again counter scissors, decides not to change their selection. The opponent playing scissors, wanting to counter rock, now plays paper, moving one turn in the cycle of the options. Paper beats rock, so the opponent now wants to play paper again, and the player now wants to play scissors, again moving one turn in the cycle. Notably, if the player wanted to predict the opponent's action after the first game, in which rock beats scissors, the player can adjust accordingly. Since the opponent will make one turn in the cycle from scissors to paper, the player can make one turn in the cycle as well, from rock to scissors. As before, the options rock, paper, and scissors themselves are somewhat indistinguishable. If players are making a decision based on the results of the previous game, they only really need to know how much to adjust. But they do correctly need to know how much to adjust. Each player has the option of making 0, 1, or 2 rotations, each representing another layer of anticipation in the opponent's adjustments. Interestingly, the choice of 0, 1, or 2 adjustments forms a rock, paper, scissors triangle of its own. Adjusting once beats not adjusting twice beats adjusting once, and adjusting not at all beats adjusting twice. After enough games, players might start recognizing patterns in how the opponent drifts between strategies and patterns, and build strategic responses at that level as well. The statement I just made about adjustments is true regardless of the origin point. Adjustment refers to adjustment from really any established common pattern. It doesn't necessarily have to be whatever the last thing the opponent selected was. If the enemy player can reason about the decision that the player is making, then the enemy player can also anticipate it and adjust accordingly. A player can choose to strategize at any layer of reality, and it all still shakes out as the same guessing game. Pick one of 3 identical options. There's a deep, inescapable, almost fractal-like form of symmetry at play in this behavior. The rock, paper, scissors triangle of mutual anticipation is quite impossible to escape. So let's say you're thinking, okay, we can do all this guessing and prediction, but can I just sort of choose whimsically? I could randomly select options with my brain. Well, okay, you can certainly try, but humans are very bad at actually randomizing their behavior. We have loads of unconscious biases that influence us, which might be hard for us to see, but easy for our adversaries to detect. Players do have one respite, one saving grace, which is to intentionally defer their choice to an external source of randomness. Maybe you roll some dice or something, and choose rock, paper, or scissors based on that, based on how the die rolls. If you can actively adapt between various patterns or seek a true source of randomness, you do increase the chances that the result will end up being truly random. And this can favor you if the opponent is winning. If they understand your patterns better than you understand theirs, it's certainly better to perform maybe vaguely evenly, or ideally slightly better than evenly, than it is to be losing. But that choice has to be somewhat intentional and requires actively finding new sources of randomness. And frankly, it also isn't likely to get you to win in the long run, since if the opponent also is able to randomize, you're probably just going to kind of perform evenly forever, right? And most importantly, if the opponent can see the dice you rolled before making their selection, then you're definitely not in good shape, because they'll punish you. And at that point, maybe you can start adjusting what actions the dice represent. What each number range represents might mean a different thing in order to outwit the opponent. In other words, you might make an adjustment, and then suddenly you're playing rock, paper, scissors again. This choice to find a true source of randomness, if only temporarily, it opts out of the game in a certain way. You're asking for a random resolution rather than influencing the game yourself. And while this can be favorable, like I said, it's not really going to cut it in the long run. You're going to have to start guessing at some point. You're going to have to find some flaw in your opponent or shake up your own behaviors enough to confuse them. And you'll only really start winning once you know how the opponent is thinking. I hope this story illustrates what I mean when I talk about rock, paper, scissors as a pure experience. It's the one irreducible guess between 3 identical options. The game is only that, and it's also pervasively and unavoidably that. I would even argue that rock, paper, scissors isn't just pure. It's a fundamental minigame, one of the core building blocks for building more complicated multiplayer experiences. But I certainly don't want to argue that the purity of rock, paper, scissors makes the game more fun. In fact, rock, paper, scissors alone is quite boring, or else we'd be playing it online every night. But the player experience of guessing in the pure symmetrical landscape of rock, paper, scissors includes myriad creative behaviors and theoretical ideas. And in the same sense that rock, paper, scissors forces you to observe and predict your enemy's decisions, those games will do so too. They'll force you to make decisions about how you want to approach the game. They'll force you to adjust when the opponent's choices are stronger. They'll force you to predict and respond when the opponent wants to get the better of you. As long as every option has a significant counter and players are encouraged to guess and randomize their options against each other, they are still incentivized to anticipate their opponent's choices. And it's also worth noting that purity does not mean simplicity. Equally pure versions of rock, paper, scissors can be played with 5, 7, 9, or really any odd number of choices in play. And it gets complicated fast. Higher numbers of options, meaning higher dimensions, means more complicated patterns to create and track, and a larger number of layers of anticipation that yield unique actions as well. The complexity of multiple gameplay dimensions all increase at the same time when more options are added, even when the symmetry is maintained. So as long as each option has one draw result and an equal number of winning and losing results, it's generally going to feel like the same rock, paper, scissors game, just a little more complex. Again, purity focuses on what types of experiences the players undergo. Rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock, a well-known way of performing RPS 5, is certainly a more complicated game than rock, paper, scissors, but the game won't include any other kinds of behaviors, and players won't express themselves in entirely different ways. It's just more rock, paper, scissors for your rock, paper, scissors. There is one property that is emphasized as dimensions increase, which is the concept of option coverage. I showed an example of this earlier when I said that paper safely sort of covered the two opponent possibilities of rock and paper. Even in regular rock, paper, scissors, if you're trying to detect the opponent's strategy, you might have moments where you think, okay, the opponent is most likely to choose one of two things, but you're not certain which. So let's say I'm pretty sure the opponent will choose rock or paper, but I don't think they're going to play scissors, right? Playing paper is a good idea here. Scissors has a chance to win and a chance to lose, but paper can't lose and still has a chance to win. So there's this idea that with more options available, as you try to predict enemy patterns, you may want to cover a large number of options sort of safely, right, in order to have more time to narrow down what the opponent's trying to do while minimizing the chance that you lose. So as dimensions increase, as players have more options available to them, this aspect of the game definitely gets a lot more complex, but it doesn't really change the game's texture or the way it's played. Now, in one of these higher dimensional rock, paper, scissors games, what happens if we tweak the numbers a little bit? Obviously, if rock or paper or whatever wins too heavily or wins against too many things, it might be that the game breaks. We can't just arbitrarily adjust options to be stronger or weaker and keep the same behavior. But let's assume we just tweak the numbers a little bit, enough that options aren't identical, right? So that rock wins a little more strongly against scissors, or paper is a little weaker against, this other thing that isn't in the main three, against lizard, right? Whatever. Just enough that the options aren't identical, but little enough that both players still have to select somewhat randomly between all the choices. In game theory terms, this corresponds to any game where there's no dominant pure strategy. It seems perfectly reasonable that at the outset, you might select an option based on some preference you have in the environment. A high or low risk tolerance, for example, might impact how you choose things at first, but your opponent will eventually adjust to your choices. And I've already asserted that both players will eventually have to randomize in this game, so as we've talked about, humans won't do so well at that. So you might instead prefer to try and predict your opponent and react to their choices. Once you do, you're playing rock, paper, scissors again. Ultimately, whenever we compete against an adversary in a repeated game, it's hard to avoid these elements of the player experience. Rock, paper, scissors represents the desire to predict an opponent's behavior. It represents the assertion that every player should always have some chance to win. It encourages creative expression, finding new ways to understand and reinvent yourself. It encourages empathy, to see your opponent's thoughts and feel their strategy the same way you do your own. As we do so, we see things we didn't see before in ourselves, and we teach others about our own experiences too. And that's why we play rock, paper, scissors. Because whenever we cannot simply overpower our adversaries, whenever we cannot look to outside influence for help, whenever we have nothing but our wits and our hopes to drive us, we choose to use the information our opponents have given us about themselves. We choose to play rock, paper, scissors when the game itself is not enough to win. And it rarely is. To design the first game for this series, I don't want to change too much about the rock, paper, scissors formula. I could explore imbalanced games or use techniques from modern games to enhance the experience. But I want to explore more of that in the next video, so I'm going to stick to the basics for now. There's a bit of a two-sided statement I've been making throughout this video. On the one hand, rock, paper, scissors is just another mini-game for creating a statistical outcome. It's a building block for yielding the results of an interaction, like a dice roll or a drawn card. On the other hand, rock, paper, scissors is intensely personal, and knowing your opponent is the strongest tool you can have, since ultimately they're the source of the randomness as far as you're concerned. While the latter is true, I don't think we need a new game to prove it. Rock, paper, scissors itself is enough. But when the enemy is not randomizing very well, or if they're randomizing with a subset of the total options available, then it's true that the game when repeated is something of a long-term value problem. How many wins can you get per game thrown? To show this, I've created a simple roguelike built off of rock, paper, scissors 7, meaning rock, paper, scissors with 7 options available. Put simply, the player begins with rock, paper, and scissors and must win 5 games against an opponent with a random 3 options from the set in order to defeat that enemy. After defeating the enemy, the player can either upgrade one of their options or claim a new option that they can use in their set. When the player adds a new option, so do the enemies, and the goal is to survive until both players have access to all 7 elements and then win a final game. Now, to be clear, the AI is getting some random set of options, which the player's options, might behave better or worse against. And the AI is just going to randomly select between its available choices. So, I'm not really expecting the player to win the guessing game, right? It's really just the vehicle for random outcomes in this game. You're not really going to be able to play true rock, paper, scissors in this game. But the idea is that careful planning and strategy around upgrading your option set will allow you to cover enemy options well enough that the player can win against and maybe even fully dominate some opponents, right? Now, if the player spends too many battles getting upgrades, they may leave themselves weak enough that a bad encounter could end the run. But if the player progresses to higher levels too soon, they might leave themselves too much, in the whims of chance, right? Essentially, as the player progresses, they have to balance how greedily they upgrade against their risk tolerance level, which, ideally should be basically like any other roguelike. I do also want to adapt this design so that you could play against an opponent, like a human opponent. And in that case, I do propose that the guessing game element of rock, paper, scissors would absolutely be present. And hopefully you can try that out soon. Just it wasn't a focus yet. In the meanwhile, I hope that this design can show you a few of the general themes of how strong option coverage is and how you can dominate strategies in sort of various different ways, either through covering options or just through like options that are very strong or whatever else. As I continue in this series, I want to dive into other specific ways that games integrate their mechanics with the rock, paper, scissors experience. For example, in your favorite fighting game, the real-time and visuospatial nature of gameplay makes it so that while one particular choice may typically beat another, that may not hold true if the player takes the action at the wrong time or in the wrong place, for example. Those spatial and temporal constraints in the game might create a strict advantage for one player if certain conditions arise. Fighting games also emphasize the mental stack, a concept that usually comes up when there are a lot of possible options which each have their own relevant responses. Since game conditions can alter which rock, paper, scissors minigame you're playing at any given moment, players can hide their intentions and then surprise enemies by suddenly putting them in a situation where some option or set of options is stronger than the opponent is ready for. If you're interested in those ideas and more minimalist game designs using them, hit the subscribe button and I'll see you next time. And if you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like or drop a comment with any feedback or comments you might have for me. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much.